Hey Nick, how you doing this afternoon?
Doing great, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. So it's been 12 months.
Yeah, crazy, right?
12 months. Yeah, not 12 months for anything in particular other than, the global pandemic that has
Yeah,
turned everybody's lives sideways for the last 12 months.
that's right. And we're still fighting through it. There's seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel, but we've still got a ways to go for sure.
Yeah, the last few days of news regarding vaccines and their trajectory of infections has been good. And
Yeah,
so it is encouraging, but we're still dealing with a lot of question marks and a lot of upheaval in our daily lives.
absolutely. So, but I'm excited about today's podcast. We're kind of taking the other side of this in kind of what we learned from COVID and what we learned from living through this pandemic from a financial standpoint. So just kind of looking at this from the other lens, if you will, and some of the key lessons and takeaways that we took out of it.
Yeah, yeah. So plenty of financial planning lessons over the last 12 months, anyway. Um, in addition to lots of just general life things to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
So, the first one from a financial standpoint is pretty obvious and something we talk about in good times and bad times. But, if ever there was a year when predicting the market was obviously a fool's errand, it was 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. From, when to get out to when to get back in. If I think back to where we stood with some of this stuff and I was thinking of how I would have predicted that, I don't think I would have
Hmm.
done very well.
No, I would have been wrong. 345 out of 365 days, I think, if you had asked me what my gut said we should do. Which
Yeah.
so I'm always glad that we've got a pretty strong philosophy and a pretty strong theoretical underpinning to what we do. Because if we were going by Dave's gut, it wouldn't have worked out very well in 2020, and it generally wouldn't have worked out well a lot of times.
Yeah, same here. When we think of when we first heard about it, it was just like, oh, it's just another one of those SARS things. It's,
Right.
in China, and that really should have been the time you would have been getting out of the market. And the
Hmm.
bottom, the pit of despair, would have been the time to get back in. And everybody thought it was only going to continue to get worse from that point.
Yes. Yeah. We reached the pit of despair much faster than we have in other
Yeah.
in other cycles. So everybody thought there was more to come yet. And I've said it a lot lately, but if we had said to people last January or February, we're going to be dealing with a global pandemic all year, and the economy is going to be topsy turvy. Oh, but by the way, the Standard and Poor's 500 is going to be up, 20% at the end of the year. You'd have thought we were certifiable.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
the big lesson is don't try to predict, don't try to time the market, and stick with your philosophy, because over time it will work. And we saw that in 2020 sped up 100 times because we saw the bad side and we saw the good side all at once. So here
Yeah,
we are.
the one thing I'll say about it, it was nice of how short-lived it kind of was. It was a huge drop. Probably broke some records out there somewhere in a lot of different ways, but the recovery was also very fast. And so just proof that if you kind of, I don't want to say ignore it is the right word, but just,
Hmm.
stick to your guns and have that plan and make those decisions before it happens and don't alter things drastically when it is happening. You're going to be in a lot better place, and you're going to get through a lot of things that you might not have gotten. Timing the market would not have helped. Let's put it that way.
Right, right. And so point number two on the list of financial lessons is understand your risk tolerance. And you know March of 2020 was not the time to sit back and think about how much risk you were taking in your portfolio, right?
Way too late at that point.
Right. The time to make those decisions would have been January of 2020, or now would not be a bad time to reassess. A lot of times, especially with newer investors, if folks hadn't been through the 2008 2009 cycle, I've always thought asking somebody who hadn't been through that kind of thing what their risk tolerance is kind of like asking a private in boot camp if they're brave. Until they've actually been in combat and been in the trenches, they really don't know how brave they are or how they're going to react. Right. And until you've watched your hard-earned savings plummet 25% in a matter of weeks, you really don't know what it's going to do to you emotionally. But now we've kind of been through that, and now's a good time to sit back and say, yeah, it was ugly, it was brutal, but I can make it through that and can make it through that again. Or, boy, I was really close to throwing in the towel, and I just can't go through that again. Whatever the answer is, and it should always be done in the context of what you need to take as far as risks. But assess it when times are better, not in the middle of the problem.
Yeah, and that's really a great point, because it goes along with the lifelong investment philosophy of buy low and sell high, right? And so if you're worried that you're over risked or you have too much equity or risk in your portfolio, now's a great time to do that because things are going really well. And so de-risking would make a lot of sense because you're selling to some degree at a high point. Where March, April would not have been a great point because it's kind of too late at that point. You're selling at a low point if you're reassessing that risk. And not to say you shouldn't do it at that point if you haven't done it at all, because nobody knows the direction in March and April, but you would have been much better off doing it in January than you would have during the bottom. Right.
And kind of the cousin of that point that I would make as our next lesson was, one thing I guess maybe this is more like from the advisor's point of view. One thing I learned over the course of last spring was that a lot of people learned hard lessons in 2008 and 2009 and were able to keep it together this time around a little bit better. I remember phone calls in 2008 and 2009 with clients, and back in March of 2020, I was kind of expecting a lot more of the same, and I'd call people and expecting the worst, and instead I got, we're more worried about the health situation. The markets will be fine. We'll be fine. We're not worried about that right now.
Yeah, so I think that's probably a combination of a couple things, right? That's probably a combination of there's a global pandemic going on. Maybe investments are the most important thing as opposed to a financial crisis, which is all about finances. But I think also for our clients, we have these conversations on a regular basis, so they know what their risk is, and we're trying to prepare them. Hey, this is your portfolio as it's constructed. If things go terribly wrong, this is what it's going to look like. And so I would urge that for all investors to take that, and not just percentages, but dollar amounts, because if your mind hasn't been there, it's much easier if okay, I could lose potentially, 20% of my portfolio. So if I've got $1 million, that's $200,000. And if you have those numbers in your mind and you're not surprised by them, it's much easier to be patient and calm than if you haven't gone through and done those exercises of what your risk level is and what that really means in dollar terms.
Right. And a good exercise in that regard is to look at that dollar amount, look at the percentage, look at the dollar amount, look back at what your portfolio would have done during 2008 and 2009 is still, my favorite period to look at for these things. Look at how your asset allocation would have behaved during that time, but also look at what would have happened in later 2009 and 2010 and 2011. And because I think people lose sight of that. I'll still hear people say, I lost everything during 2009, and they don't realize they had made it all back within 18, 24 months if they hadn't done anything different. And that's an important point, and it kind of frames that reference of, yes, I may, my portfolio may drop by X dollars during a period like that, but by doing nothing and just being smart about it, I'd be back whole within a reasonable amount of time, whatever that would be for your particular portfolio. I think people that we've shown those numbers to are actually pleasantly surprised that, that's not too bad. I could sit it out for 13 months or 14 months or whatever it needs to be.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And to some degree, I feel like our clients get a little bit annoyed with us continually having a risk conversation, but this is
Right.
exactly why,
Well,
because we don't know when it's going to happen and we want them to be prepared.
yeah, well, I'd a lot rather have that conversation now, back to the point we were talking about a few minutes ago. I'd a lot rather have that talk now than be on the phone in the middle of a, down slide that's been going on for 3 weeks, trying to figure out if it's going to keep going or stop.
Yeah, absolutely.
So speaking of things we talk about all the time, all of this is so much easier if you have an emergency fund, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's the most boring financial tool, but man, is it probably the most important, or at least up there, to have cash to get you through times like this can't be understated.
Yeah. It's a whole different conversation when several months worth of spending needs are covered in safe investments that you can get at. And that's particularly true. I think that was highlighted for our clients that are still working, that, and knock on wood, and luckily, we didn't have too many who were dealing with layoffs last spring and summer. But, it's going to be the same time that the market goes down. It's going to be the same time that you have to worry about whether your job's going to be there for you. And, knowing that money is there and in the bank and safe is what lets you ignore the portfolio and concentrate on what's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and we tell people this a lot, but it's so much easier, even if you're a little bit more conservative, to put money in after the fact than it is to take it out if you weren't conservative enough. And it also gives you the opportunity in March, April, if you've got some extra cash to put
Take
it in
advantage.
to make a contribution and take advantage of the valuations back then. And when we did have some clients that were lucky enough to be able to do that.
That's right. And that was perhaps, the buying opportunity of, well, I don't want to say of a lifetime, but,
hopefully the decade, right?
Right. I like buying opportunities. I just don't like the rest that goes with it.
Yeah.
So one of the more interesting things that came out of the last 12 months that I think is a good thing is seeing people really be able to focus on aligning their spending goals with what they really value.
Yeah. And not to get too philosophical, if you will, but basically the world was put on pause and everybody had to kind of take that silence and think about, what am I spending money on? What's important to me?
Right. When all of a sudden you can't spend it on anything, you realize what you miss and what you don't miss.
Yeah, for sure.
And, we've both seen clients go through traumatic experiences, either a really serious health scare for themselves or a loved one, or a premature death in the family, that tends to have that mechanism of refocusing how you're using your money and what's important. And in a way, again, knock on wood, and most of our clients came through the last 12 months, physically unscathed. In a way, it was almost like a vaccine. Like the experience was almost a vaccine in a way that it provided us that exposure to what it might be like.
Right.
And I think I talked about this a couple of weeks ago on this same podcast, but one thing that I had always kind of felt a little funny about was how much we spend eating out, right? And then all of a sudden you can't do it, and you realize that's something you miss and something that maybe it is worth spending the money on. There's plenty of other things that I haven't been able to do in the last 12 months that I don't need to do anymore.
Yeah.
So, and I think talking to friends that had long commutes and spent a lot of car time, and then had to work from home all of a sudden, they're going to have a hard time going back to those long commutes. And fortunately, I think we're seeing a lot of employers wrap their heads around the idea that maybe they don't want to go back to exactly the way things were done.
Yeah, the 5 day 9 to 5 in the office is probably a thing of the past. I don't see that coming back to,
Right.
to most industries where you're going into the office every day, 5, 6 days a week. So that'll be interesting. And I think, to your point, now is the time when you're realizing these things and how important they are is to make those changes, because as the vaccine rolls out and as the world gets back to the new normal, things are going to pick up and they're going to be fast. And if you don't
Mm-hmm.
make those changes to your budget, to your plan, everything will just go back to normal. And so
Right.
take
Right.
advantage
You'll
of that
fall.
pause and those insights.
Yeah. Kind of realign.
Yeah.
And then the last item we had down is to be mindful of your physical and mental health and treat it like an asset, like you would money in the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one that I'm passionate about in terms of, both those things, physical and mental health. And if you think about what happened to the health industry, we've got this situation where, they were bombarded with the COVID-19 pandemic and had to change everything they were doing, but they weren't profitable doing it. So,
Mm-hmm.
in a normal industry, when you have an influx of new people, you get excited about it, right? But
Right.
probably not what was going on at hospitals around the country,
Right.
because, the COVID-19 is not profitable for them, and it caused them to pause a lot of the things that are. And so that's going to
Right.
have a major impact down the road on healthcare, and probably specifically healthcare expenses. And the other thing to think about too is, the majority of the complications were due to pre-existing health conditions. And
Mm-hmm.
so valuing your health, both mental and physical, is really the best way to combat expenses when it comes to health and your finances.
Yeah, and interesting things along those lines too. And I should have written this down, or I should have thought about it, an hour ago and gone back and gotten statistics. But I saw something last week about the huge rise in physical therapy over the last year,
Yeah,
because people are working from home and they're sitting in funny positions on their couches with their laptops up on their knees instead of being sitting upright in a office chair, or they're sitting in that office chair a lot longer than they normally would have.
sure.
Working from home has not been helpful from the outlook of our joints and our knees and our backs. So
Yeah, for sure. And not to mention that if you're not commuting, you're not getting up and walking into the office. And if you're not leaving
right,
the house, that you really have to find something,
right,
some sort of exercise. The gyms were all closed for a long time and
right,
remain somewhat closed. And so you really have to
right.
make that a priority, because that's going to have a big impact on it's your health is one of your most important assets. And really you have a lot of control over that. And so just
Right.
making sure you're kind of figuring out what works for you, and making that a commitment, because from a financial planning standpoint, we try to predict expenses and we try to predict those things, but it's extremely difficult to do in that realm of health insurance and
Yeah.
healthcare costs.
Yeah. Well, and kind of like saving for retirement while you're working, keeping your body in healthful condition when you're 40 or 50 can make a big difference when you're 70 or 80,
Right.
potentially.
Yeah, much
So
much easier than trying to save extra money to pay for those increased
to pay
costs.
for
It's
those costs, right?
much easier to go
Right.
out and do the simple free things like, exercise and mindfulness and all that stuff.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so
So yeah, those were our big takeaways over the last 12 months as they apply to financial planning. And hopefully we won't be here in March of 22, having a similar conversation. But I think there's light on the horizon and heading in the right direction.
yeah, lots of good lessons, lots of things to take away from this. And clearly, obviously, we wouldn't want to go through it again to have these lessons, but here we are where we are, and so learning from them has been and moving forward is the best thing that we can do from this point.
Absolutely. Well, Nick, as always, it's good to talk to you, and we'll be back next week with another topic.
Been a pleasure.